He's an important part of our history. And the Storaasli Fund pays for lectures, especially those in which we welcome scholars from the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America to share with us in Canada. We're really excited to welcome Dr. Chad Rimmer this evening from Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary, LTSS. And yes, the Association of Theological Schools is often confused by Lutheran Theological Seminary, Saskatoon, and Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary. Our names are perhaps not as innovative as they might be. Anyway, we welcome Dr. Rimmer and are very excited to hear from him. He will be speaking about eco-theology, and that's a topic that is of real interest to us and to our people in our seminary. I think in a few minutes, Keiko will provide sort of a deeper introduction. Anyway, so thank you for joining us this evening, all of those out in virtual land with us and those here at Hope Seminary or Hope Church in Calgary. Thank you.
Good evening. Before I say a little bit more about our guest, I would like to welcome everybody who has joined us online and those in the sanctuary, and to take a moment to give thanks for the land where we are, land which is regulated by Treaty 7. This land nourishes us and provides for us, and it is also experiencing a time of severe drought. So I invite us to take a moment to commit to caring for the lands that we all reside on in partnership with all our human and non-human relations. So as President Harris mentioned, our guest this evening is Reverend Dr. Chad Rimmer, who is the rector and dean at Lutheran Theological Southwest Seminary in South Carolina. He is an ELCA pastor. He is the recent program executive for theology and practice at the Lutheran World Federation Department for Theology, Mission, and Justice. And most importantly, even more important than all that, he is a theologian committed to justice, to bearing witness to the suffering of the oppressed, and particularly to justice for the environment. Dr. Rimmer will be the keynote speaker at the BC and Alberta Synod's Clergy Study Conference this coming week in Canmore, and also has a contribution to the book edited by our Dr. Kyle Scheffelbein-Guerrero, Church After the Corona Pandemic. And so we are super pleased to have Dr. Rimmer with us this evening, and so I invite you to come forward.
Thank you very much, Keiko. Thank you, friends. It really is a joy to be here on this evening. And I do want to first just join that acknowledgement and gratitude and recognition for all the elders of the peoples who have their footprints in this land long before us, those past, those present and emerging, as well as all of our relations that I greet, human and non-human, here as we're gathered here tonight. And I want to also extend a couple of personal words of thanks. One is to Bishop Larry for an invitation that was to come to this part of the world, which set off this invitation to be here at the same time to give this lecture here on this night. And it's a sign of the fruit of a lot of international and shared ministry across the world for a lot of years. And in the course of that work, was blessed to be a colleague of Keiko's, and what a great thing it is now to be reconnecting in this new way as I have moved to my new position as rector and dean at the Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary, which is another LTSS, as we've said here. So it's really great to come home here to my friends here at LTSS. And part of that gratitude is that I bring with me tonight what's called a goodly heritage, which is a history of the other LTSS that I'm going to leave as a gift of thanks for the invitation here this night. And I gather to give this time together on this theme of petroculture and promise, from extractive to self-exceeding ecologies. And I just want to say a word about who I am a little bit more, because I think it's important that when you know who it is that's sharing and what the perspective is. I do this, as Keiko mentioned, as an eco-theologian by training. But in my own story, I would just say in my ecological biography that my eco-theology runs much deeper than my theological studies, because I was formed, of course, in a part of the world in the southeast of the United States, not the Canadian Rockies, but the Appalachian Mountains. And the mountains and the trails and the places of wilderness and the animals and the minerals that are there that shaped me and formed me. And it's the reason that my first studies were actually in biology and chemistry before I discerned a call to ministry and went on to study theology. And when I was starting my overseas trajectory of ministry with the National Council of Churches in Denmark, is when I first started to engage on issues of faith and ecology. And I realized at that point that this connection brought my two worlds together, and these two worlds of thought, of how natural sciences and theology can not only be in dialogue, but to be in an integrated, synergistic partnership to answer some of the ecological questions that we face. And so it's that I have been pursuing in different ways in my ministry around the Lutheran World Federation, and now, of course, as I mentioned, back to the land where I am originally from, in the southeast of the United States, which is quite a bit of culture shock to come from 17 years abroad. And so that's why it's a joy to have this now first invitation since returning to that part of the world to this part of Canada. So thank you very, very much. And that explains a bit of the methodology of what I'm going to share here tonight, considering petroculture is something that pertains specifically to this context here in Alberta, of course, but also me as your southern neighbor. This petroculture and the industries of extraction that have grown up around it. And I want to focus it there because I want to be a little more specific about the context, not just about caring for creation or climate justice, ecology in general, writ large, but to focus on this specific issue that applies to us, and in order to sort of raise our consciousness about what's at stake at the heart of this question for us, and hopefully pose some good theological entry points for thinking about this. So if we can go to the first slide, I want to begin this thinking, actually the next one, the second slide. I want to begin this thinking with the words of a poet and a seer, Rumi, who was a Sufi Muslim poet. And he wrote, "The ground's generosity takes in our compost and grows beauty. Try to be more like the ground." There's lots to say about this poem, but what I want to lift up is this composting aspect of the ground, the earth that receives and then gives back in beauty. Larry Rasmussen is a Lutheran theologian who has written a lot about earth-honoring faith, and he calls our attention to the fact that the soil, or the earth, is, as he calls it, a self-exceeding creature. He's referring to this point, that creation as a whole, but specifically the soil, gives more than it receives. On the one hand, that's a startling reality because there is a finite amount that the soil can give without receiving back in return to compost and do what the earth does. But he names that in order to engender really a sense of gratitude for the plenitude of life that the soil continues to provide for us. And it's in this way that the soil, says Rasmussen, is self-transcending. That is, it participates in life beyond itself. The soil, in other words, takes in all of the matter of life. And more than that, it actually is a host to different forms of life. All of the microbes and the millions of bugs and creatures that call the soil, that participate in this composting and this returning, this self-exceeding capacity of the earth. And it's actually Wendell Berry who put these words to it. Wendell Berry was a farmer and not a bad theologian in his own right, who said that organisms die into each other's life and live into each other's death. And this exchange goes on, round and round, the wheel of life rising out of the soil, descending back into it through the bodies of creatures. And Joseph Sittler would say in his address to the WCC Assembly in 1967 that in this way, when we see this giving and this self-exceeding capacity of the earth, he calls this an evocation of grace. That's how the earth goes about growing beauty. It's this self-exceeding capacity and this agency of the earth. We actually hear this in the Genesis narrative in chapter 1 and verse 12, where it's the earth that brings forth vegetation. The earth has this capacity to self-exceed and bring forth life. Well, in my courses on faith and ecology, I teach about eco-spiritual practices, and one of those is called manifold engagement. And this is recognizing that one of the greatest ecological problems in the modern capitalist era is this idea of commodification, because it externalizes and hides cost. Larry Rasmussen writes that urban people of necessity appropriate carrying capacity from elsewhere through the commodification of a market-organized nature. So in other words, we distance ourselves from the real cost of this capacity of the earth to produce and grow. We externalize or hide the real cost of energy that it takes to do this work, that it takes to cultivate or transport our food, to purify our water, or to fabricate our goods. And the problem with this, as Rasmussen says, is that we view commodities, of course, as our conveniences, which is the definition of the word. And he says that morally, in order to give something its real inherent value as a creature, they should be viewed as less convenient. So there's an exercise I do with my students where you are to consider something in your closet or in your pantry, my belt, for example, to really think, where did the leather come from? Where was the metal mined? What were the workers, the hours, the people that put in the work and the time and the energy to produce it? How was it transported? Where did it get to you? And what is the cost you paid versus the cost and the value that was put back into the lives of the workers and the system itself that brought that good to you? We should have to think about these things more deeply, not hide or externalize cost of our relationship to our food or our products or other creatures or the minerals of the earth that are used up in the fabrication of our goods, but actually think about them in a complex way. He calls this a manifold engagement, a profound engagement with these members of the global commons that helps us understand them as sacred, as sacramental, that is, participating in life and self-exceeding. The idea is that we'll be more grateful to these things, to the earth itself, and to that which we encounter, including that which is composted, that includes fossil fuels. So I want to think for just a moment then about the culture that's around this fossil fuels. So on the next slide, we have petroculture. To think just a minute about what I mean by petroculture. Karina Baptista of the University of Virginia defines petroculture as a complex of social, economic, political manifestations and cultural representations. Oil culture, or petroculture, is defined as the broad field of cultural representations and symbolic forms that have taken shape around the material of oil in the 150 years since the inception of the U.S. petroleum industry. And aesthetic practices, cultural forms, and public discourses reveal the status of oil on two levels. First, what Imre dubs the commodity, the original commodity, the source of all the moving matter as concerns travel of bodies and products and its availability to us as a commodity or convenience. And second, as an ontological construct that shapes actual social and political life. And petroculture is one of those ontological sources that allows advanced capitalism to be embodied in our life and in our lives. So there are these aspects of petroculture, and I don't want to spend a lot of time explaining or deconstructing because I think it probably doesn't need to be, but I'm going to name them, and then if you have more questions during some question time, we can certainly say more about them. But based on that definition, the economic manifestations really is the drive to reduce and externalize those costs, including transport of goods and services. The political, of course, or our political systems that support these ways of life, that measure the quality of life economically in terms of gross national or domestic product, as well as having national security policies that are based on energy sovereignty, or at least control of the market. The ontological manifestations are just the physical ways that we construct highways and borders, the infrastructure of our built environment in cities, and the way that we extract energy and create and use energy itself. The cultural aspects, of course, are related to the way we live with petroleum-based products, the commodification, the ease and utility for plastics in our life. This includes, of course, it should be said, life-affirming technologies that benefit health and well-being. This is not all negative about the use of plastics in our lives. And this includes the aesthetic manifestations, withstanding textiles that you and I and everyone, I think, who's watching are wearing plastics right now in our clothes, as well as our homeware products and the things that make life comfortable. So if petroleum and fossil fuels are, in fact, part of this culture that we have created, this petroculture that nurtures our life, that humans have curated, then we could also expect to have a petro-theology, or some theological reflections that would help us to critique this petroculture. And I want to begin thinking through these aspects by thinking first about energy itself. And so on the next slide, then, energy has been thought about historically in a lot of different ways. And I want to begin here with a concept that David Bradshaw wrote about exceptionally well. I'd commend to you in his book, Divine Energies and Divine Action, exploring the essence-energy distinction. And there's a lot to say here. I'm actually going to say more in the sermon at the study conference next week about this concept of divine essence and energies. But the point here is that the patristics even, and certainly the Apostle Paul, focus on energy in terms of being originated from the one source, which is the Holy Trinity. And the idea there is that it's the relationship, the Trinitarian doxological relationship of diversity perfected in love, the perichoresis, that gives the one source of divine, that essence that gives the source of multiple divine energies in the world. We can think of fruits of the Spirit or different manifestations of God's energy in the world. But this way of thinking about energy is not the way that energies have been thought about in other parts of the world. Beginning with Aristotle, energy was not so much a question of spirit, but a question of motion, a question of potentiality. It was a question of how does an object move from potential to actualization? How does an artist get a sculpture out of a block of marble? And that takes energy, that takes movement, that takes forces to bring that about. Now, of course, this caused a lot of confusion theologically with people like Aquinas and even Luther, who I would contend actually gets he gets Aristotle wrong because he's reading him through Aquinas. But the point is that they were asking different questions. Where Aristotle was talking about motion, theologians were talking about spirit. And we have a vestige of this, interestingly, in the Augsburg Confession, where in Article 1, there's a caution about this interpretation of the Spirit. There's a whole other lecture to go with that, so we could leave it there. But the point is that it's this understanding of forces and energy that led through the modern period into the scientific revolution, and of course evolved through Newtonian physics into the laws of thermodynamics. And I want to say just a really brief word about this, because this is significant. There are 3 laws of thermodynamics. And the first is that energy is neither consumed nor created. And theologically, this makes sense when we think about God as the only one who's been able to create ex nihilo, out of nothing. Since that creation, all energy exists. It changes form, and this has to do with work and heat, but the energy that is in the Earth system is a closed system in this sense. It's the same amount of energy. That, like Rumi says, gets composted, gets used, gets exchanged, but it's always the same amount of energy. Our consumption patterns, however, what we do with that energy technologically has now sequestered energy in different forms that are inert, that are not accessible to the Earth, that can't participate in that composting, recycling of energy these days. So it's not just a question of how we use them, but how we sequester energy into virtually non-usable forms in these days. But it's the second law of thermodynamics that I want to point us to, which is that center picture and the one on the left. This is the concept of entropy, that in the universe, the way that energy creates structures generally has one flow. It goes from a more solid state to a state of chaos or a state of equilibrium. Okay, so think about it in terms of ice to water, and this picture in the middle might be helpful. The form of ice is a solid state where molecules are held in a form. And the tendency, the energy that holds that ice together, will always tend to melt unless it is refrigerated or other energy is applied to it. In a normal state, that is what's always going to happen. Those molecules will spread out. This is why something that's frozen will always turn to something warmer, not the opposite, right? In a natural state. So this has been called, this concept of entropy, this second law of thermodynamics has been called time's arrow, meaning that will run only in one direction, right? In a natural state. We have different arrows of time that we can think about in this way. The first one on the top is the psychological arrow of time. Why do we say that time always runs forward? Well, because we remember the past. We don't remember the future. We age in one direction. And except for the movie Benjamin Button, no one has ever aged in reverse. The same thing is in terms of the cosmological arrow of time, that the universe is expanding. The universe is not consolidating. It's that law of entropy that's even acting on the planetary and cosmic level. And it's the same thing with energy, that thermodynamic arrow of time, that there will be this increasing state of entropy, not a state of coming together. Water will not freeze unless there are other forces that are applied to it, climatically or through our freezers, for example. This is significant in the way that we relate to energy because it raises the question of time. And this is a significant question and and a goal of interdisciplinary dialogue between the natural sciences and theology actually helps us with this notion of time. And I'm thinking again when it comes to our relationship and understanding of fossil fuels and the time that it takes for fossil fuels to be created and the time it takes for us to use them. Elizabeth Johnson's text, Ask the Beast, explores this dialogue between the natural sciences and specifically evolutionary theory and theology. And that scale of geological and planetary time, what Joanna Macy calls deep time, complicates the story of life emerging on our planet. But like Rumi, it invites us to a more manifold engagement with understanding the earth as self-transcending, but in a way that internalizes the cost of our rapid use of fossil fuels compared to the time that it takes for the earth to engage in this cycle, this self-exceeding cycle of composting for the sake of creating beauty. Part of this relationship Vitor Vestella wrote about as the topological turn from place to time. This is part of the modern and Western view that's been imposed on our sense of being, where traditional peoples had a way of seeing time as cyclical, happening within a given place, the turning of the seasons every year within this local ecology. And there was a Western tendency to turn that equation around and to focus on time as a linear process that happened, that places were subject to. And it's this imposition of this kind of linear understanding of time, which really had the effect of changing our relationship to it. But even if we think about time in a linear sense, it should be that the sheer scope and scale of planetary and cosmic time would be enough to complicate our view of these manifold costs of our use of fossil fuels. Remembering that even Peter writes in the second letter, chapter 3, do not ignore this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like 1 day. The concept of time is something cosmic. So I want to look for just a moment, and this is a little break from my voice alone, to the voice of Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's got a wonderful summary and a help to help us think about the scope and scale of geological and cosmic time.
This cosmic calendar compresses all of the last 13.8 billion years since the Big Bang into a single calendar Earth year. Every month is a little more than 1 billion years. Every day, a little less than 40 million. A single hour is almost 2 million years. That first day of the cosmic year began with the Big Bang, almost 14 billion years ago. Nothing really happened in our neck of the universe until about 3 billion years later, March 15th, when our Milky Way galaxy began to form. 6 billion years after that, our star, the Sun, was born. It was August 31st on the cosmic calendar. Jupiter and the other planets, including our own, would soon follow. The atmosphere on Earth was a toxic environment for our kind of life. Then, September 21st on the cosmic calendar. Tiny creatures that could shrug off the methane and eat carbon dioxide and sunlight for breakfast found a way to make a living in the ocean. By gobbling up the carbon dioxide and giving off oxygen, they turned the sky blue. And then, the oxygenation of the atmosphere created the ozone layer. For the first time, life was free to leave the oceans for the land. Now, life could grow larger and venture forth into new territories. Sometime on December 26th, about 200 million years ago, the first mammals evolved. They brought a new feature to life on Earth, the neocortex. And then, late on New Year's Eve, a mutation occurred in the DNA of just one of our ancestors. One base pair of a single gene programmed the neocortex to grow larger still. Maybe it was a random zap from a cosmic ray, or a simple error in transmission from one cell to another. whatever it was, it led to a change in our species that would ultimately affect every other species of life on Earth. By the last second of the cosmic year, there was no place on Earth that we had left untouched. All of it comes down to nothing more than a single rung on our tiny DNA ladder to the stars.
What he does is to take the whole course of cosmic history and map it out on one calendar year, and walks through the process of the formation of the Earth and all of the fuels and all of the elements that it takes for the Earth system to live and to move in that self-exceeding, that composting way that nourishes life. And what is amazing is that all of human life comes into being and takes all of the course of human history within the last day of the calendar year. And all of our consumption and production with relationship to fossil fuels happens in the last second of the cosmic history that it took to produce all of that energy. Often in climate justice discourse, we think about the limits of the Earth's carrying capacity in terms of the amount of fossil fuels that we're using and in terms of the emissions that we are putting out into the world. But I also want to encourage us tonight that we need to think about the rhythms of our consumption, meaning the time. And in terms of discussion around energy, time needs to be one of those significant aspects of our thinking, both respect to our production and consumption and our lifestyles. So now our conversations around petroculture relates not only to the limits, but the rhythms of energy. But today, most of climate justice discourse and most of the conversation within the UNFCCC processes, for example, of which the Lutheran World Federation is heavily engaged, of course, are with respect to emissions targets. Well, that is an important measure of the economic green shift that we need to make. But I want to share this piece of information with you because I'm really proud, because having moved back to the United States last week, I bought a Chevy Volt. That was my car of choice. I've gone EV. And I'm so proud of myself because I'm part of the zero emissions group, right? This is wonderful in terms of emissions. And I would encourage us all to be thinking about these things. But the problem is that it runs off of a lithium battery. And where is lithium mined? On the next slide, I want you to take a look. Look in the bottom left corner of Alberta there. Lithium mines that are here all over Canada. So emissions are one issue, but the extraction industries that underwrite both our petroculture and our green shift solutions need to be more deeply interrogated. And here I want to lean into fellow Lutheran Tara Schwerin-Rowe and her excellent book of Modern Extraction, Experiments in Critical Petrotheology. Because extraction from the earth of these minerals is about power, but not power in the sense of energy or potential or becoming, which can be a rather positive concept, as we looked at earlier, in the sense of emergent processes or even process theology, but rather thinking about extraction in terms of disintegration of ecologies and disintegration of the whole. And here, I want to just speak really quickly through this Genesis narrative, because the biblical story that's narrated in the first chapter of Genesis is a story, in some senses, of the move from harmony and integration to disintegration. Our creation narrative is one that is told about balance and harmony between night and day, sky and earth, land and sea, animals of the sea, animals of the field, animals of the air, a balance between human beings. And when the fall story is told, it's a story of disintegration of those relationships, of those dualities, not dualisms, but harmony, dualities. The story of Adam realizing his nakedness is a story, as Luther talks about, of being turned in on oneself. The implication is being turned now away from my relationship to the other. And this creates concentric circles of ever-widening disintegration from this web of harmony that has been created and put into motion to sustain life. So we have the separation between human beings. We have the separation between human beings and the animals, where fear is introduced into the narrative. We have the separation, of course, between human beings and the divine, but we ultimately have the separation of human beings from the land itself. That's why the story of the fall really is a story of disintegration and of extraction, growing circles of extraction from the ecological web of power, which was power with. And of course, this leads to this interpretation of power as domination, as power over, rather than this one source of the energies, as the patristics saw it, which was this integrated web of life. So it's that misleading interpretation of creation, theology, and anthropology that underwrites what turns into this move for extractionism. And we know that here in Canada, it has very deleterious effects. Some recent climate watch sites name these as the top: increased wildfires, deforestation, the effects of damming, which disrupt certain patterns of wildlife, such as salmon running upstream. Also, the mining in tar sands in Alberta, and the extraction that's happening around the tar sands. Now, we know that the modern methods of extractionism leads to greater circles of this ecological disintegration. Some of our indigenous friends call this the Great Unraveling. But it's always been part of the colonial project all over the world, where extraction has been the means of colonization. There is the extraction, of course, of the more than human creatures for commodification. There has been the extraction of land itself and the dispossession of land from peoples. And it was John Locke, of course, who was famous for having codified the idea of usage value as a tool for dispossession. That is, nature is only valuable if it's economically useful. And this was coupled with a common British law about usage of land. If you were using the land, meaning economic production, then you could claim it as private property. Or vice versa, if you were not using the land to produce, then you cannot claim to own it in perpetuity. And here we see the basis for colonial dispossession when it appeared to the settlers that indigenous people are not using the land to produce in the economic way that Europeans were used to. This is the basis of some of the laws which are operating in Israel and Palestine today for claiming eminent domain. And of course, there is epistemological extraction, taking people away from the land where they're able to make knowledge and the sources of their cultural knowledge, and even where decisions are made. It was French sociologist Bruno Latour who described the creation of maps in this part of Canada in terms of inscriptions being transported to distant centers of calculation, meaning London. And the same, of course, happened for the states in the United States and all over the continent of Africa during the same period. And then there is the one that I'm speaking mostly about tonight, which is the actual extraction from the earth itself. And this sort of extraction industry is based on the fetishization of fossil fuels, and I mean that in two senses. I mean both imbuing oil with magical powers for our freedom and to sustain our lifestyles. But I also mean in terms of the mere reification, extracting oil from its ecological context in the earth, where it's part of the soil's system and capacity to sustain life. To remove it from that context, to disintegrate it, is to remove part of its inherent value as a self-exceeding part of the earth system that Rumi called us to know, and to give it new value, which is economic value. Now, I want to show this next slide, which actually comes from the Canadian Mineral Strategy, from exploration to recycling, powering, nope, the next one, sorry. That's the integrated whole. Powering the green and digital economy for Canada and the world. I'm going to read just a little part of this Canadian Mineral Strategy about the value chain. A value chain of mineral extraction is the set of activities that add value at each stage of production and a delivery of a product to market. For example, a product upgrade or process innovation. Building on the success of Canada's Mines to Mobility approach, which has attracted major investments in the manufacturing of zero-emission vehicles. Pause, see, there's my bolt, right? This strategy focuses on critical mineral exploration to recycling. It goes beyond the foundation established from mines to mobility by building capacity at each stage of the value chain, from exploration to recycling and everything in between. The value chain for critical minerals includes 5 segments: geoscience and exploration, mineral extraction, intermediate processing, advanced manufacturing and recycling. An illustrative example of a critical mineral value chain is here below, and that's what you're looking at there. And so this is all about adding value, which means, of course, only one thing, and that is economic value, and economic value of these minerals to support various economies. And so this is a question that a petrotheology should help us critique about our petroculture. When it comes to value, what are the values that we are using when we are critiquing things like value chains? And here theology speaks, and specifically the gospel, to proclaim the good news for all creation, but also to speak about the inherent and in situ value of fossil fuels kept in the ground, precisely because of the destruction. And so on the next slide, I've got a few pictures, and one is from West Virginia, and the area of the world where I originate from, and the rest of them are from this part of the world, and one at Fort McMurray, in fact. These are images of the sort of ecological disintegration that happens when something is valuated in isolation from its ecological whole. And we see the effects, whether it's strip mining, whether it's fracking, or whether it's mountaintop removals that destroy sacred ecologies, both in the sense of how they're sacred to people and people groups, but also in that sacred sense of that self-transcending value. When they're disintegrated, the ecologies no longer function as self-transcending beings. Bernstein and Fink, who wrote Let the Earth Teach You Torah, wrote a chapter on the idea of Baal Tashit, which forbids destruction of ecologies, based on a passage from Deuteronomy. It's actually rules on a siege of what's allowable. It's a sort of just war doctrine from the 20th chapter of Deuteronomy. And it is clear that in the process of war, you must not destroy fruit trees by wielding an axe, or divert water, or stop up a fountain. According to the Babylonian Talmud, in war or in the normal course of life. So in other words, the more than human creation should never be collateral damage to human life or processes. Destruction means trying to achieve a particular end through war or lifestyle by making use of more valuable things, meaning other creatures who are ends in themselves, not means to our ends. This is significant, that we're not allowed to destroy ecologies for war. Then I would submit that we shouldn't certainly be allowed to destroy whole ecologies for energy use or life processes. But the question always has to remain in terms of ethics and justice. Who stands to benefit from it? And for whom does this create new justice problems? What is the usage value of the energy that we're extracting? What is the manifold cost that we need to internalize in terms of transportation, or the cost of destroying an ecology versus the cost and the benefit of leaving ecologies in their place? Of course, this raises questions about inherent value, but it also raises questions about beauty. It also raises questions about where and how life is experienced by our children and by the children of other species. And that's why before the last topic that I want to raise, I want to stop at this point and just sing a song for a little break, but also to share the words of somebody that we now know as Yusuf Islam, that you probably know better as Cat Stevens. And he wrote this song in 1970. And it's called Thinking About These Defaced Places of the Earth, Where Do the Children Play? Well, I think it's fine building jumbo planes, taking a ride on a cosmic train, switch on summer with a slot machine. You can get what you want, 'cause you can have everything. I know we've come a long way, we're changing day to day, but tell me, where do the children play? Well, you roll on roads over fresh green grass for your lorry loads, pumping petrol gas, and you make them long and you make them rough, and you just keep rolling on, seems like you can't get off. I know we've come a long way, we're changing day to day, but tell me, where do the children play? Well, you crack the sky, scrapers fill the air, and you keep on building higher till there's no more room up there. Will you make us laugh? Will you make us cry? Will you tell us when to live? Will you tell us when to die? I know we've come a long way, we're changing day to day, but tell me, where do the children play? So one of the questions, and this is where I'd like to end, when we reflect on our relationship to petroculture, that Cat Stevens helps pose is the question of value, the question of aesthetics, the question of the qualities of life. Where do the children play? And here we don't even mean human children, but all children of every species. But he also poses the question of freedom, which on this last slide I want to end with here, which is a considerable ethical category for Christians when we think about our relationship to petroculture. Because petroleum products are designed to promise us more freedom, right? Think about car commercials. Think about homeware products. Think about textiles. That part of it is the freedom to be able to go, to be able to engage any environment, to be able to move, and to be able to have rhythms of life. But a more manifold engagement might call us to new understandings of time, even with things like electric vehicles. In order to charge them, you have to add in extra time on your journey, right? We need to be thinking about new rhythms of life, new rhythms of travel, new rhythms of eating in season and out of season, new rhythms of light and dark and our relationship to lights and seasons, slowing down time and giving us a new moral moment to imagine a new culture and new rhythms of life. And this is what I want to propose is a pretty critical piece of Christian theology and Christian ethics, theological ethics perspective that can help move us to this mode of seeking only technocratic solutions, to seeking new cultural adaptations and new cultural models of living together. Because that moral imagination that it takes to create new ways of life is part of the freedom that is ours in faith. And as it turns out, Lutherans have something to offer here, because Luther's understanding of Christian freedom, on freedom of a Christian, was not in the same vein that we see in advertisements from petroculture. It was not freedom to do nothing or freedom to do what you want, but freedom to serve, freedom for something else. And Luther spotted that we are people who are freed for love, freed for acts of love. Now, of course, we all know that in virtue ethics, Aristotle was, of course, partly right, as are all virtue ethicists. If you want to play the guitar, you have to practice the guitar. That's the habitus, the basic acts of practicing. But Luther saw the limits of virtue discourse. In this case, the limits are the fact that the goalpost will always be moved, that there will always be a new target that you're chasing. And this is true, partly, in the green shift towards new technologies, and we need to keep pushing in that direction. But the point is more general, that as Christians we are freed to love, that we're actually freed to care for the earth as our neighbor, in whatever that looks like, and we're freed also to care for the soul of the earth, as Bill Plotkin puts it. This is the doxological aspect of our care for creation. Sabbath is given to us as this moment of moral freedom, of moral imagination. First, a freedom to not produce and consume in the ways that are driving petroculture, but then secondly, the freedom to imagine what life would be like if we did not disturb the land in these ways. That means freedom to create cosmologies, new ways of life, freedom to create new pathways for our life together, freedom to retrace our steps through our culture and create new symbol systems to give new value to the ecologies in which we live, and to create new spaces for grace, or as Willie Jennings calls them, geographies of grace, so that we move from geographies of extraction to geographies of grace. And in this last slide, I have just some images. And here is where the storytelling could begin. but I only want to tell a couple and then wrap this up so that we can have some time for some questions and conversation. Because some of these ministries that are happening around the world and around the Lutheran World Federation are, in fact, shaping new cultural pathways, transforming areas of extraction or contested areas of land into spaces that are geographies of grace. I want to point to a few of these. Some of these are the right to play movements in some of our churches around the world that are reclaiming these spaces, exactly as Cat Stevens said, for children to play. But some of them are our youth, such as the National Committee of Indonesia, who are encouraging their youth to return to the land and to actually know how to farm them ecologically in ways that both cooperate with local laws, but also bring life back to ecologies that have been disintegrated. The one on the bottom right is one from Bethlehem. And this is our Lutheran brother, Daoud Nasser, whose family owns this hilltop that has been contested for many, many years. Based on the codified values of usage that I mentioned earlier, the land is contested. And so what he had decided to do with his family was to turn that hilltop into, in fact, a garden. And there he teaches, brings together Christian, Muslim, and Jewish youth to learn how to do ecological farming in that place, to reclaim this part of the world. And there uses it as a way to make peace, an interfaith project with youth. And then on the bottom right, or the bottom left, is an image from the other LTS, where I'm now serving, which is to take the space, which is in a food desert and a place of great racial inequality, economically speaking, and to turn it, the land that we have there on the seminary, into food gardens. We work with the children of a local school called Koinonia, as well as some of the local organizations, one of which is an organization of women of color who are getting women to learn how to garden again in urban settings, both in terms of health, in terms of food sovereignty, and in terms of economic justice in that place. So these are all examples of ways that our communities of faith can model these new rhythms, can add value back into our local ecologies that are creating a new culture that communicates something about not just life in praise of God, but the ecological whole of our local ecologies as doxological in the shape of God, that bear a prophetic witness to the petrocultures and the forces that are about disintegration, where part of our ministry of reconciliation is to recreate and reconcile the whole in these places. So I want to stop there, and I want to open up both for questions about anything that I've shared, but also maybe examples from those that are gathered here or online about one or ways that your community or places that you have seen are creating these anticipatory communities, these geographies of grace that resist and restory this petroculture in our lives through our witness and our ministry in local context in ecologies. And I want to recognize the millions of ways that this is already being done. And in the last slide, to end with the words of Rumi, since I began, that indeed there are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground and let the beauty we love be what we do. So I would love to hear what it is that you're doing where you are. Thank you, friends.
Those of you who are on Zoom, if you have questions, if you could put them into the chat, and then I can read them out to the room that's here. And those of you in the sanctuary at Hope, if you have questions, if you could use this microphone so our Zoom friends could hear us. And I'll have the sanctuary people start first because they don't have to type anything. So everyone is thinking, but I was really struck, I'll add a comment. I was really struck when you were talking about manifold consumption, and you use the issue of your belt and where does the leather come from and all those kinds of things. And for me, the resonance between that and Luther is give us this day our daily bread. And the way he connects bread to sort of everything in the world, there's a lot of connections there that I'm seeing, that we just look at things in such individualized pieces, both for consuming and for giving thanks. And we forget the entire web of relationships. So I really appreciate it. And maybe there's something more you want to say about that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Keiko. And it is, I think that's part of the externalization, I mean, of cost and relationship, which is, it's a symptom of kind of advanced capitalism, which the idea is to externalize cost and to decrease liability along the way. And of course, that has an effect of decreasing cost for things like even bread in the grocery store. But considering give us this day our daily bread, this goes, I would think, also in terms of the commandment, Luther's explanation for the commandment to not murder, which is not only to not kill, but what should I do to benefit? You know, what's the positive implication of that commandment? Is what are the thousands of things that I can do to benefit the life and the livelihood of my neighbor? And if we think about these costs, you know, to pay less for a pound of coffee beans means that there's some injustice down the chain, you know, where someone is either not receiving their due, or the real cost to the environment of monocropping coffee, for example, right, is another one. So I focused on extraction, but even things like monocropping is another example of land usage that is disintegrating, you know, the value of that forest, for example, where we know healthy forests are diverse forests, but monocropped places are really sort of energy deserts. You know, you can get a coffee plant to produce more beans, but at what cost? If there's no other, you know, no other sisters there growing together, right? And so I think you're exactly right. Like we need that deeper engagement, that manifold engagement with these simple things about where does our food come from. You know, and this is something very easy that we can do with our children, of course, and thousands of us have programs for this, you know, to get children planting in the ground again, to get familiar with what Rumi called, you know, this composting, what Rasmussen calls that self-transcending capacity of the earth. Where does our food and life come from? So I think anything we can do to familiarize, you know, people with food cycles is part of it. But also in terms of time, those rhythms that I'm speaking about, you know, eating in season. And here we do have consumer power, right, in the grocery stores, whether it's through advocacy and public policy or whether it's through buying power, you know, to try to convince our grocery stores to only buy and ship and sell foods in season somewhere, you know. I remember coming back to the United States and being able to buy a pineapple in January. And I knew that wasn't right, you know. So it's these little things, I think, that we can consider, help people consider. Where does your daily bread actually come from? Yes, indeed.
I'm struck that you went back to Locke, which I think is a really important piece, going back and critiquing his argument that value is derived from use and from human labor. Going back to Locke again, I'm struck also by his distinction between the religious and the political. In the extent to which he ties the religious to really to life after death, and posits all of what we do here as the political, and essentially walls off the religious from the political. I'm struck that in essence you are taking another step in breaking through that wall and reminding us that actually our relation to all our relations is essentially theological, as well as being essentially political, and that there is something fundamentally false about that bifurcation between the religious and the political. And I wonder how far reimagining humans as participating creatively in the world, in the divine image, becomes a way of starting to assess what those externalities are, and starting to find ways to include those externalities creatively, because value ceases to be about what humans add to the world, but value becomes about the way in which God understands the world. This is getting a bit long. It's just that you've struck so many pieces. And another, of course, is the reflection on reconciliation, which reminds me of knowing the world as God would have us know it, rather than knowing the world through human eyes.
Yes.
So, some thoughts.
Thank you. And I think yes, in all of the points, though, I think it is the one that I'm really trying to focus on is just what is the inherently theological question here, is the doxological question, you know. The shape of God, the shape of the Trinity is relationality. Diversity and perfect union, you know, there's divine simplicity, but the divine simplicity is love, right? And it's that is what is creative. And here's the start of the chain, I think, that you've touched on, is that I think this grows out of a long project which was doomed to fail, which is to try to suggest what is the imago Dei and relate that somehow to rationality, or, you know, all of these iterations of what is the image of God, where process theology here helps us, where we say the image of God is precisely creativity that grows out of that relationality, where it's right relationships, just relationships. That's the wisdom woven into the fabric of creation. And so if that disintegration happens, that's when it falls apart. And if we're not part of, that's the ministry of reconciliation given to us in Christ, right? Begun in Christ Jesus, given to the church, to be participants in that, restoring those right relationships within the web is part of nurturing creativity. It's not only being artisans of peace, but being artisans of nurturing creativity in life. Yeah, and I think part of that disintegration, and you've pointed to it, comes from that same time period, which is the disintegration of the sacred from the secular. And that's that same move about the flattening of space, the imposition of linear time, right? From the world as complex space, which we would call now the sort of demystification of, you know, of the world. But it is exactly that. It's that nominalist move, you know, where what happens here is sheer, is shallow, things that are sacred or that belong to the afterlife. All of that was in that moment, you know, that led to these grand ideas that created these political and economic systems that would underwrite this sort of disintegration. And I think that's why I agree that this is fundamentally for us first a theological move, to say that's not the shape of God, it's not the wisdom of creation, and we're called to participate in that reconciliation. And then here comes ecology and the natural sciences saying, yes, and if you do that, you hold together those webs that are synergistic, those webs that are creating healthy systems that can then sustain life. So it should be no surprise, I think, to people of faith that theological move, and this is what we hear from our indigenous friends all the time. We knew that. We know this. That theological move then is a map or a model for these new cultures, socially and politically, that we're trying to prophetically call for and model as anticipatory communities in the world today. So thank you for that.
We still have some people working on typing questions, but since you are here and you do have experience with LWF and climate justice, I'm wondering if you might take the opportunity to share for just a few minutes about LWF's work with climate justice and how, as Lutherans, we can bear witness to that, participate in that, support that work.
Absolutely. And I think what I'm speaking about here is more of sort of a grounded kind of poetic move, right? Making in communities, getting to know our local ecologies, and what can we do even at the parish level, for creating these anticipatory communities, these geographies of grace, where we are, because that requires knowing our local ecology. In terms of our relationship to these processes as the Lutheran World Federation, this is a difficult reality about climate justice at this international level. Is on the one hand, it's a global process, but on the other hand, climate work, or let's say care for creation, is very local, right? We have to know our local ecologies, our local forests, our local rivers, and take action there. But what the Lutheran World Federation does is to link up the local and the global. And so we as churches, churches like ELCIC, synods down to the congregational level, have stories. We know how the earth is being affected. We know communities and neighbors that are being affected by climate change or by practices and policies, such as land misuse or extraction, et cetera, et cetera. And what we have the capacity to do as a communion of Lutheran churches is to bring those local voices to these international spaces. And that's what the work of the Lutheran World Federation has been about. The first statement on climate justice or care for creation at that time was actually in 1977. So this is not new for the Lutheran World Federation. But we have been for many years taking delegations of young people to the climate COPs. Remember, there are two COP processes. There's biodiversity COP and climate COP. LWF has been taking delegations to the climate COPs, training them to go into the negotiating spaces and to work with Geneva Interfaith Forum and all of our ecumenical partners to bring the witness of faith-based communities from our local places like here into those spaces. And what I can say about it is that it has been exceptionally fruitful in terms of, particularly around the time of the Paris Accord, when the witness that was spearheaded by the WCC, the LWF, and ACT Alliance really was able to sort of move the needle and start to get conversations going with the Secretariat of the UNFCCC. And what we have heard steadily since then, or seen, is that the space for faith-based actors to come and to speak into these intergovernmental conversations is actually opening. Because governments know that there's only so much you can do through policy. And that whole process with the UNFCCC is a trust-based process anyway, right? Everyone has to set their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement and then follow up on them. And this is part of the struggle. But what communities of faith can do is to translate those into value systems and to bring the meaning, like we're discussing here tonight, to local levels. And in turn, to bring that ambition and that commitment to achieve these mechanisms and these ambitions for mitigation and adaptation back to that level at the international conferences. And so it's been a joy to actually work with our young people from around the communion, to train them and to go into those spaces and to meet with the negotiators and the heads of state and really bring a passion and a witness for the urgency and the ambition that's needed within that political and economic architecture. And the last thing I want to say is actually something that I heard from one of those negotiators to us to bring back to our churches, which was this, and it was a plea. And they said, we have experts in public policy, we have experts in climate science, we have experts in political processes, and we can all come and do our part. But how to reach people? They were looking to communities of faith and to churches. And the reason was this. This was a German official who said, churches in this polarized world are one of the last places that can bring together people across spectra, different spectra, that are normally divided, because you're bringing people together based on something that unites you, something of faith. And so you have the capacity to sort of bring people together around this issue and have conversations about caring for the environment, about these environmental policies that we're trying to discuss. And so the churches, seen from the governmental perspectives in our polarized world, are one of the last places that can do that reconciling work and host these conversations. So I say that as a word of encouragement to our friends within the church. As polarized as it feels, and as difficult as that feels often, even in our congregations, to bring our members together for certain conversations, from the outside and in the political and social level, it's still obvious that churches, because of our proclamation, because of the good news, that we still have that capacity to bring people together around these difficult conversations. So I hope you hear that as encouragement.
Thank you, Chad. That actually addressed one of the questions in the chat that talked about fossil fuel companies in that sort of sense of principalities and powers, and how do we move from small scale action to really getting at the large scale. So I think the work that you've described talks about that. There's also a growing discussion in the chat about how does one buy responsibly, so avoid buying food in January, like pineapples in January, without then compromising the livelihoods of workers who are growing those foods on other parts, in other parts of the world. How do we reckon with and balance our own personal actions when we're recognizing that other people are part of this economic structure that benefit from our purchases?
Exactly. There are, I think, two things I want to just say about that. That's a great question. And the first is in terms of livelihoods and just transitions. Now, the notion of just transition, let's say, to green economies, or these sorts of economies where we're buying goods responsibly in this way, that the question's asking, within season and internalized cost and things like this. This is deeply important. And part of it is in a green shift, where we're talking about the technological solutions, which is moving to things, that are greener, quote unquote. We have to keep in mind the transition for people whose livelihoods had depended on the other industries. And I know this is, I don't know, I need to ask if this is a conversation here in this part of the world. I know in Appalachia it is, because you have great swaths of people whose livelihoods for generations have been in coal mines or, these mountaintop removal industries for mining. It is true that socially, if we were to move today to 100% renewables, most of those people would be out of work. And so we have to have an eye on how do we transition people, reskill, retrain. That needs to be a social project, I would think. And that is what some, refer to as just transition. But as a social, political, and economic project, that's the difference in the other part of the question, which I would point to this phrase of common but differentiated responsibility. It is true that part of our buying is an aspect of this, but I don't want to lose sight of the proportionality because I think most governments and most corporations would be really happy if the entire weight of the green shift fell on individual consumers. But there's a concept that grew out of the Rio meeting called common but differentiated responsibility. We have a common responsibility for this environmental question. All of us, individuals, corporations, governments, international organizations. But the load of that responsibility is differentiated. It should not lie completely on individuals. If corporations or if governments are the ones, who have benefited the most from extraction, for example, then who bears the most burden of sort of shouldering the policy and the technological shift? So on the one hand, of course, we want to all encourage that sort of eye on buying. What part can we do in terms of retail even, buying things that are green technologies or within season, like our friend asked the question. But we also need to stay engaged at the policy level and the advocacy level to make sure that the differentiated responsibility of corporations and governments is also being upheld, and the total responsibility doesn't fall on individuals who often have no choice, right? If you live in food deserts, you have to buy what's there. That's an example. So it's a great and difficult question. Yes.
So I want to, on behalf of all of us in person and online, thank you so much. You kind of did a magic trick of reverse entropy, where you took all of these different pieces and you brought them back together again and centered us in God. So thank you very much. And to those of you who are on Zoom, thank you for joining us. We are very glad to have you coming from all different parts of the country, and wish you a good evening.